Good day. Today is Thursday, 31st July 2025, and as I make this program, it seems to me that the President, Donald Trump, the President of the United States, is getting himself deeper and deeper enmeshed in the massive tangle that his tariffs stroke sanctions are entangling him in. It's becoming very difficult to keep up with his statements and messages on Truth Social. I said in my program yesterday that until yesterday, in fact, the president had been wise to avoid making too many bold and assertive comments about Russia, BRICS states, trade between Russia and the other BRICS states and all of that on Truth Social. But yesterday, all that restraint fell away, and he's been bombarding us with messages ever since. And a lot of his anger appears to be focused on India. India, of course, being one of the key BRICS states. He's already quarrelled badly with Brazil. He's imposed 50% tariffs on Brazil. He says that Brazil should not be prosecuting the former president, President Bolsonaro. He's unhappy about a Brazilian trade surplus with the United States, where in fact Brazil actually runs a deficit in its trade with the United States. He doesn't like some of the actions of the Brazilian Supreme Court and various restrictions that Brazil is seeking to impose on U.S. social media companies. As I said in previous programs, you might agree or disagree with President Trump on some of these points. You might think he's making some valid points on some of them. But tariffs are supposed to be either a revenue-raising measure or a measure intended to provide protection to American industries. In other words, they are a tool of economic and taxation policy. And Trump's use of tariffs to punish Brazil for all of these sins, real or imagined, was using tariffs in a completely inappropriate way as a form of sanctions. My colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou, made exactly that point, both in programs we did together on the Duran, but also in programs on his own channel. Anyway, the president yesterday moved beyond that. He's made statements again talking about BRICS. He says that BRICS is a mortal enemy to the dollar, to the US system, the US trading system, and that he will not allow BRICS to destroy the dollar, dismantle the dollar and dollar supremacy. This is actually remarkable because just about a week ago, after the summit, the BRICS summit meeting in Rio, President Trump was crowing that because of the threats and warnings that he had given, the summit meeting in Rio had been a failure and hardly anybody turned up, and that BRICS was effectively dead. Well, it's apparently resurrected itself in, 10 days, a week? I've lost count of the time. Now it's a deadly threat again. He's angry with India also for being a member of the BRICS, and he makes more threats against India. He says in a Truth Social post that India operates horrible tariffs against the United States. It's completely inappropriate that it should do that. He speaks of India as a result having minimal trade with the United States, which by the way is actually true, just saying. He says that India buys weapons from Russia and continues to trade with Russia, despite the fact that the Russians are not agreeing to his demand that they stop their war in Ukraine. So he announces that India, though apparently it is a good friend, that is what the Truth Social post said, he announces that this good friend, he's going to impose 25% tariffs on them, plus an additional penalty for some or all of these other things, though he doesn't tell us what that additional penalty is going to be, presumably additional tariffs because India is buying Russian oil. And then shortly after, he gives the impression that, in fact, the negotiations with India are far from concluded, and we should all wait to see what the outcome of those negotiations is. So he appears to walk back his earlier threat to impose 25% tariffs plus a penalty on India. And then he follows up with a particularly angry message on Truth Social, in which he says that he doesn't care what India and Russia do with each other. They're both dead economies as far as he is concerned, which is, of course, completely different, completely changes the position from what he was saying before, that India and the United States are good friends, and what he's also said about Russia too. The fact that Russia could be rich if it traded with the United States, and what a wonderful thing that would be. Anyway, he's now reversing himself on all of those things, and the implication is that he thinks that the negotiations have failed and that the Indians are not going to move. Now, I am not absolutely certain, as at the time of making this program, that the negotiations between the United States and India are indeed over. There was a report in the Financial Times that the Indian trade delegation has actually left Washington and has returned to India. So presumably there has been no agreement. The negotiations went badly wrong. Perhaps that is what provoked the last post, the last message that President Trump published on Truth Social. Who knows? But it does seem that he's very angry with India altogether. And it's a strange contrast, as I said, from his comment about India being a good friend. And it's an even bigger contrast with what his own vice president, J.D. Vance, said when he travelled to India in, I believe it was April, and visited India and spoke about how cooperation between India and the United States was a win-win, and what a wonderful and burgeoning relationship that promised to be. Suddenly, the president is angry with India, and all of that is apparently permanently on hold. We will see tomorrow when the tariffs on India are supposed to be imposed, what the actual level of the tariffs is going to be. Now, the Indian government has been extremely restrained in the face of all of this cascade of messages. Indian officials have told the Financial Times that they've not yet received any official message from Trump. Everything that they know so far comes from Truth Social, and they're waiting for some official contact. But the Indian government has also said that in its trade negotiations with the United States, the Indian government will work to defend Indian interests, and in particular those of medium and small businesses and enterprises. And of course, it seems that the major sticking point, putting aside the question of Russian oil, the main sticking point in the negotiations is that the United States has demanded that India lift its restrictions on imports of grain and dairy products to India. Of course, India continues to be a heavily agricultural society. There are large sections of the Indian economy that are burgeoning. There are clusters, high technology clusters developing. There's manufacturing, there's significant manufacturing in India today. But overall, I believe it is true that the majority of the people of India still live in small communities, that many of them still engage in peasant agriculture or small farming agriculture. And of course, for them, for people like that, imports, mass imports of huge quantities of American grain and milk and such products, well, they could be devastating. And the Indian government, Prime Minister Modi, must know that these people, many of them, form his core electoral constituency, and I suspect that he doesn't want to lose their support, and that makes it unlikely that he will relax the restrictions on imports from the United States of these agricultural products. These people also are, of course, extremely vulnerable to inflationary pressures within India itself. We are living in a time of relatively high inflation overall. They are going to be particularly concerned about any rise in energy costs, which of course have a knock-on effect on prices in India altogether. That is the major reason why India continues to buy Russian oil. And again, I don't think the Indian government is prepared to give up on doing that. Now, the Indians have tried to be reasonable. They've tried to cut bargains, cut deals with the Americans. They've told the Americans that alongside Russian weapons that they want to buy, they will also buy some weapons from the United States. They've also said that they're prepared to buy energy from the United States, oil and liquefied natural gas as well. But I suspect that they cannot go all the way, or won't go all the way. They won't capitulate to demands which they see as excessive and unreasonable, which is what Donald Trump is insisting upon. Now, there's a number of things I want to say here. The first is that in my program yesterday, I said that as far as I knew, India was running a deficit in its trade with the United States. It turns out that it is not. It turns out that it is running a small surplus of $45 billion. It is, however, true that trade between India and the United States is relatively low, as President Trump says. I cannot understand why this would be a point of grievance for President Trump. He talks incessantly about the value of protection in building up American industries. Given that that is so, I'm not sure quite why he finds India's protection of its industries and of its farmers so objectionable. Isn't India doing what he says he wants to do for the United States? But he seems to take this all very personally in some way. But anyway, India can probably live with a 25% tariff if that's what the United States imposes. And though I don't think the Indians would like it if tariffs were to go much higher and trade between the United States and India were to stop, then I think the Indians could probably live with that too. The Financial Times made the point that growth in the Indian economy is domestically driven. It is not dependent upon foreign trade in the way that trade is important for some other economies. Having said that, obviously, the Indians are going to be disappointed if their trade with the United States is ruptured. I know that there are some people in India, particularly within the business community, who do want bigger trade with the United States. But in the end, I don't think that they're anywhere close to being the majority. And though they are an influential and powerful constituency within India, I think that Prime Minister Modi probably realizes that if he were to go along with Trump's demands, even if that constituency would be happy, Indians overall would not be, and he might have problems in future elections. So that's what I think the general policy in India is. There's a few further points about India that I wish to make. Firstly, I have had some discussions with people in India. I remember that back, I think it was in 2016, Prime Minister Modi, shortly after he was elected, came to the United States, addressed Congress. There was a lot of talk then about huge development of trade between India and the United States. The Indians at that time seemed to be holding out for massive US investment in India. I have been told that the Indians have since been deeply disappointed that the trade relationship with the United States that they imagined would take off has failed to do so, and that this has gradually caused India to reassess the value of the relationship with the United States and to revisit instead BRICS, the relationship with China, which does, by contrast, seem willing to invest in Indian industry and infrastructure on a scale that the United States seems reluctant to do, and has made that trade relationship with China and with the BRICS more attractive. So that's one thing I wanted to say. The second is that India continues to be extremely annoyed with President Trump's conduct during the recent clash between India and Pakistan a few weeks ago. President Trump claimed that he'd brokered a ceasefire. The Indians hotly dispute that claim. They say that President Trump did not broker a ceasefire. What happened was that Pakistan asked for a ceasefire and India agreed. It's been pointed out to me that if President Trump had actually wanted the fighting between India and Pakistan to stop, it was within his means to do so. Pakistan was flying F-16 fighter jets. He could have simply told the Pakistanis that they needed to stop doing that. And as this is American technology, the Pakistanis would have had no choice but to comply. In the event President Trump didn't do that, and altogether the Indians were annoyed by the stance that President Trump and his government took about the whole conflict. The fact that President Trump is now talking about investing in Pakistan's oil industry, developing an oil and gas field which may exist, though I know some people think perhaps it doesn't. I have no idea about the geology, and I'm not going to get into a discussion about that oil field and its potential. Anyway, the point I'm going to say is that the fact that President Trump is talking about reinvesting in Pakistan, I think is going to rile the Indians even more. So I'm not saying this story between India and the United States is over, but as of the time of making this program, it seems to be so. Given what an unpredictable and volatile situation we're looking at, it's not impossible that tomorrow we might learn that some kind of deal has been done. If that is indeed what happens, then of course I will revisit the question in my next program. But anyway, for the moment it looks as if the negotiations have failed. Anyway, President Trump is busy cutting deals with other countries. He claims to have cut a deal with South Korea, but I'm sure he has done. South Korea accepting tariffs, not as high perhaps as he threatened, but still significant tariffs. And South Korea apparently is another country that's promising to buy energy products from the United States. The European Union, Ursula von der Leyen, said that the Europeans would buy over 3 years $750 billion of energy products from the United States. South Korea says it's now going to buy $100 billion of energy products, gas and oil from the United States. None of this makes any sense. The United States, or at least President Trump, is promising to sell gas and oil to the Europeans, now to the South Koreans. That is in excess of America's capacity to produce and sell. It's increasingly looking to me as if these numbers, the $750 billion the Europeans were told to buy, the $100 billion the South Koreans have been told to buy, that these figures are just being plucked out of the air, that there is no reality at all behind them. Meanwhile, President Trump obviously is now continuing to make threats against Russia. He's got himself into a utterly pointless and completely bizarre set of exchanges with, of all people, the vice chairman of the Russian Security Council and former president Dmitry Medvedev. Medvedev yesterday pointed out that Trump is at risk of becoming Sleepy Joe. In other words, that he's following where Joe Biden went, and that would create problems with Donald Trump in the United States itself. That, of course, hit a very raw nerve. President Trump doesn't like to be compared with President Biden in any way. And, of course, as I've discussed in several programs, what caused Biden to lose the election was the cost of living crisis. Or rather, what caused the Democrats to lose the election was the cost of living crisis in the United States. And it was what led to the failure of Biden's presidency. So this is a very, very, very edgy product for Trump. So, of course, he couldn't resist it. He told Medvedev, watch yourself, you're treading on dangerous ground, which is perhaps true. But then, wasn't that the point of Medvedev's message in the first place? So, of course, Medvedev delightedly said, well, isn't it excellent that the mighty president of the mighty United States is so concerned about what a former president of Russia is now saying? And then, of course, Medvedev, again, twisted the knife a little. He said that if Trump is himself thinking any dangerous things, he needs to be aware that of Russia's dead hand machine, or call it what you will. And essentially what he was saying was he was threatening Trump and the United States with nuclear war. In fact, if I can explain it, what Medvedev is alluding to is that the fact that the Russians have created a fail-safe in case there is a decapitation strike by the United States against the Russian leadership in Moscow. They created, I believe it was back in the 1970s, a system which no doubt has been significantly updated since then, whereby if there was a decapitation strike which eliminated at that time it was the Soviet political leadership, but today it is the Russian political leadership, then the Russian nuclear forces would be immediately ordered to retaliate, and there would be a mechanism for sending signals out, informing them about what had happened, and causing an immediate retaliatory strike with the full range of Russia's enormous nuclear arsenal to take place. So what Medvedev is in effect insinuating is that if Trump is thinking of carrying out the same kind of decapitation strike against the Russians that the Israelis recently attempted and failed to carry out against the Iranians, then don't even think about it, because if you do, if the Americans do, then the dead hand, the Russian dead hand, will come into operation, and, well, World War III will follow. I don't myself like exchanges of this kind. I think this is a flippant way of conducting these kind of discussions. I don't think it's proper to threaten the United States in this kind of way. But then I don't think that President Trump's own threats are appropriate or proper either. I think all this should stop, and I certainly don't think world leaders should be communicating with each other in this way through posts published on social media. Anyway, we've had other discussions and things going on. We've had far less about what's happened between the United States and China. It seems that there has been no agreement in Stockholm between the United States and China. It looks as if the current 90-day pause is going to be extended for another 90 days, which will take us into September. But one way or the other, it looks as if the United States is drifting, as I've said, further and further and deeper into all kinds of economic wars with many and more countries around the world. It's winning in some places. It's won with the Europeans. It's losing in other places, perhaps with India, undoubtedly with China, which of course is the one that matters. And of course the Russians, if the United States were to impose 100% tariffs on Russia, the Russians would simply laugh. Their trade with the United States has collapsed already. Tariffs on that scale will make no difference. And though in the long term it would make a successful trading relationship between the United States and Russia impossible if those tariffs were to remain in effect, I think that the Russians, seeing this unpredictable volatility, this eccentric changes of decision, probably are saying to themselves, well, probably it's not in our interests to develop long-term trade with the United States. In the end, after all, we have BRICS. Let's concentrate on that, and let's concentrate on China first and foremost. Well, that's how it looks to me today on the 31st of July. Tomorrow, the 1st of August, is of course another day. Perhaps we will have another dizzying change of direction tomorrow. Perhaps, as I said, India will buckle, though I don't generally expect that. The Indian ambassador to Russia has, by the way, been giving further interviews to TASS, to the TASS news agency, talking about how India wants to actually intensify economic relations with Russia. But then, of course, it may be that the ambassador doesn't actually speak for the cabinet in Delhi. Who knows? But anyway, I don't expect India to buckle, but if it does, well, as I said, I will deal with it in my next program. Overall, and in the end, what we're looking at is a gradual breakdown in global trade, or at least global trade as we have known it. Eventually, things will rearrange themselves, patterns of trade will rearrange themselves. But I'm going to say this, the chaotic way in which this is being done, the fact that we now have completely different rates of tariffs against different countries, rather than a single clean tariff against all countries, all of that ultimately, I think, is going to work against the long-term economic interests of the United States. To repeat again, I am not someone who has any fundamental, principled objection to tariffs. I understand the arguments against them. They may be right, but economics is not my background. I know that tariffs and protectionist policies have been used in the past. They were used by the United States. They were used by Bismarck in Germany. Some feel that they were economically successful in the past. Maybe that's right. Maybe they would be economically successful in the future again. But even allowing for that, this clearly is not the best way to go about it. When you have different tariffs levied at different rates against different countries, that all but invites countries that want to continue to trade with the United States in some form to do so, pretending that they're other countries or going through the mechanisms of other countries. It's going to create chaos and disruption and confusion in world trade. That inevitably is going to ramp up costs. That's going to be translated in the end in higher prices in the United States, despite over and above whatever upward pressure on prices the tariffs themselves cause. And beyond all of that, inevitably, countries that want to trade with each other are going to say, look, important though the US market is, and it is not anywhere near as big and as important proportionately as it used to be, but important as the US market is, let's circumvent it, let's get round it, let's trade with each other, let's stop wasting time trying to second guess what the Americans are doing or trying to come up with clever ways to get round their sanctions. Let's instead focus on our own trade, which is easier and smoother, and develop trade and financial systems outside the dollar and American-led trading system. In other words, it's going to produce exactly the opposite result to the one that Donald Trump says he wants. Anyway, that's where I think we're going. Now, on top of all of this, Trump himself has linked his decision to impose tariffs on the Russians, on others, to the conflict in Ukraine. He's threatened the Russians with sanctions and tariffs and undisclosed stuff if they don't end the fighting in Ukraine. He wants them to do this, well, he said in 50 days or then in 10 days. Now it's been suggested that it could happen as soon as tomorrow. As I said, it's a constantly moving feast. Perhaps his threat to Medvedev, that Medvedev is walking on dangerous ground, is a threat to bring in tariffs tomorrow. Who knows? It wouldn't surprise me. But anyway, what makes this completely bizarre is that Trump has himself publicly said that though he's going to impose these tariffs and these sanctions, he doesn't actually know whether they will work. He doesn't, in fact, believe that it is going to end, that they are going to end the war. He, on the contrary, expects the war to go on for a long time. In which case, what is the point of these tariffs and of all of these sanctions? What actual purpose do they serve? to immiserate Russia, to immiserate Europe, to immiserate the United States, to create more problems in the global trading system. I mean, it makes no sense to me at all. I've described all of this, all of these various moves, all of these comments that are appearing on Trump, on Truth Social, as government by tantrum. This is increasingly what I have to say this all looks like to me. Now, there are some attempts to rationalize what Trump is doing. There are people who say that he's playing some incredibly complicated game of 4D or 5D or 10D chess. I can't myself see any logic to this at all. As I said, I don't think that this is ultimately going to be in American interests. But anyway, it's been suggested that the ultimate purpose of all of this is to discredit the neocons and people like that in the United States, the neocons and the globalists in the United States. Well, all I will say about that is that if that is the plan, then it is far too complicated. And if things really do go wrong, it won't be Lindsey Graham and Keith Kellogg who get blamed. It will be Trump, Donald Trump, and probably no one else. Just saying. Now, since I've brought up the topic of General Kellogg, he's actually given an interview in which, again, he's tried to explain the policy of the administration. He's always, ever since he wrote his article in April 2024, which he set out his plan, he's always spoken about sanctions being the possible way forward if the Russians don't agree to freeze the war in the way that he wants them to do. And essentially, he said the same thing in this interview. He said that Russia is a petrostate, that it depends on energy exports. He said that if the Russians don't end the war, they'll run out of money. And that the United States needs to tighten up its enforcement of sanctions, something which I can see causing a huge amount of trouble, by the way, if it's ever attempted, and which I will say in advance is going to prove impossible if General Kellogg and the Americans try it. But then he also said something which absolutely stunned me. He said that if Putin nonetheless remained obdurate, the oligarchs in Russia wouldn't be happy with him and they would start putting pressure on him to change course. Now, I can remember at the time in June 2014 when Barack Obama and Angela Merkel for the first time imposed sectoral sanctions on Russia, specifically on the Russian banking system. That exactly the same thing was said then. In fact, I can remember that there was actually a report provided to Angela Merkel by the BND, the German intelligence service, before the sanctions were imposed, which was what apparently persuaded her to agree to those sectoral sanctions in June 2014. She was told by the BND that if the sanctions were imposed, within 6 months, Russia would be brought to heel because the oligarchs would tell Putin that unless he ended Russia's involvement in Ukraine and capitulated entirely to the West's demands, then they would take steps to remove him from the presidency. And for several weeks and months afterwards, about a year in fact, after the BND gave that report and Merkel and Obama imposed those sectoral sanctions, I can remember that there were all the expectations of how the oligarchs would move, the steps they would take to overthrow Putin or to force him into compliance. I can remember specifically that I think it was in March 2015, about a year later, people who were following Putin's website came to the conclusion, a conclusion, by the way, which was unwarranted, that Putin had disappeared from the scene. And there was a whole flurry of articles that appeared at that time claiming that the coup organized by the oligarchs was actually underway. Well, shortly after, Putin appeared, very much in control. It was clear that there was no coup. And the oligarchs, well, we didn't hear anything more of them. Kellogg is living in a world that has long since passed. In the 1990s, it was absolutely appropriate to talk about oligarchs dominating not just the Russian economy, but the Russian political system. It's true to a certain extent of Ukraine today. It has no reality in terms of Russia now. 3.5 years after the Biden sanctions, if General Kellogg still believes that Russia is a one-dimensional economy, a petrostate controlled by oligarchs, then all I could say is that he is living in his own world. And if by now he hasn't understood that it is not related to the reality, then there's nothing that can be done for him. Anyway, it's alarming that those views still apparently have traction in Washington and are leading to decisions being made. But anyway, there it is. We see these decisions, they're playing out. We're probably going to get sanctions or tariffs on the Russians over the next couple of days. We're going to get tariffs on the Indians tomorrow. We already have 50% tariffs on the Brazilians. As for the Chinese, all the facts suggest that Trump is very scared to come after them again after what happened in the spring. And we're probably going to get another 90-day remission, though doubtless with more threats, which the Chinese are going to ignore. And, well, we'll see what comes. Now, I'm going to make a further prediction, which is that sooner or later, Trump is going to flip. At the moment, he's pursuing this course. He's listening to Kellogg and Lindsey Graham. He's paying no attention to Witkoff and Vance. There's been a strange arc of events. The Witkoff-Vance team seemed to be dominating in the first weeks. Then we had Kellogg reassert himself basically in late March. Then, as I said, in April, May, it seemed to be Witkoff and Vance again. Then things changed after May, and at the moment, as I said, it's Graham and Vance who are very much in the ascendancy. If things start to go wrong, if things start to look sour in the US economy, and the Federal Reserve Board, I notice, is refusing to cut interest rates, or at least Jerome Powell there is. If things go wrong, then Donald Trump has never shown any willingness to stay the course. He will turn on Kellogg and Graham, and he will start listening again to Witkoff and Vance. By then, of course, the train may very well have left the station. He'll be in a far weaker position than he was in January when he was first inaugurated, but there it is. Of course, there is another possibility that he will get more and more angry. He will listen more and more to Graham and Kellogg. He might choose the path of further escalation, at which point what is already looking like a debacle will become much, much worse. I cannot fail at this point but acknowledge and refer back to an article that was written on naked capitalism before Trump's inauguration by Eve Smith. And Eve Smith made the point then that Trump seemed to be very sold on Kellogg's plan, the whole idea of freezing the conflict in Ukraine, that the Russians were straightforwardly rejecting the whole ceasefire idea, the whole freezing of the conflict idea, that given Trump's volatile personality, that was quite likely to enrage Trump and propel him into some kind of ferocious reaction. And I think that is exactly what we're seeing play out. That is exactly how we're seeing it play out. It was exactly the way that Eve Smith said would happen. Well, there it is. Anyway, I'm not going to spend more time on all of these issues today, because there's been further important events on the battlefronts, on the Ukrainian battlefronts, which continue to drive the war. Firstly, the Russians last night, conducted more missile and drone strikes against Ukraine. I gather that they were specifically, again, targeting Zhuleni airfield near Kiev. This is where the Ukrainians and the Americans positioned the Patriot missile batteries that are supposed to be defending Kiev. It's been explained, there's been an article which I read on, I think it was Slavyangrad, which said that there is no other place where the Patriot missiles could be positioned in order to defend the government quarter at Kiev. Moving to any other location would mean that the Patriots would be out of range if the Russians were to attack the center of Kiev. So that obliges the Ukrainians and the Americans to position the Patriots there. But of course that means that the Russians know where they are and are able to attack them. And the probability is that more and more batteries are being destroyed. Well, anyway, I'm not going to get into this because this is a topic where very little information indeed is being provided. But suffice to say that there was another big Russian drone and missile strike yesterday. The other big news is that this morning the Russian Defense Ministry said that Chasov Yar has fallen, that the Russians have now captured Chasov Yar. Now, this has been a very long-running battle. The Russians captured Bakhmut in May 2023. Bakhmut is the big town close to Chasov Yar. Chasov Yar is basically part of the cluster of communities which together make up the Chasov Yar, the Bakhmut conurbation. The Ukrainians then made a major attempt over the course of 2023 to recapture Bakhmut. As I discussed at the time, most of the emphasis at that time in the coverage was on Ukraine's offensive in the south in Zaporozhye and Kherson region, Ukraine's attempt in the summer of 2023 to break through to the Sea of Azov and to the Black Sea. But the fighting around Bakhmut was at least as intense, and based on Russian casualty figures, the figures the Russians were giving for Ukrainian casualties, which are probably unreliable, but which do give us a sense of the direction of, where the fighting is most intense. The heaviest fighting in the summer of 2023 was actually around Bakhmut. Anyway, the Russians repelled the attacks around Bakhmut over the course of 2023. The Ukrainians failed to recapture Bakhmut or even break into Bakhmut. Then the Russians went on to the attack again over the course of the spring and early summer of 2024. They gradually pushed towards Chasov Yar. They then broke into Chasov Yar. They captured the micro-district that was located to the east of the Seversky Donetsk aqueduct, which bisects Chasov Yar. Then they crossed the aqueduct over the course of 2024. Then an immensely tough battle followed to capture Chasov Yar, and according to the Russian Defense Ministry, this battle is over. Now, it should be said that the Ukrainians have not confirmed this information. Deep State, the Ukrainian mapping project, continues to show areas of western Chasov Yar, at least the micro-districts to the west of the center of Chasov Yar, still under Ukrainian control. But for the record, I think the Russian Defense Ministry report is likely to be the most reliable. This has been a long battle, and one of the reasons the battle has been so long is because the Russian force that has captured Chasov Yar is actually quite small. It consists of one division of admittedly elite troops, the division in question being the 98th Airborne Guards Division, though I understand that there are also some Chechen fighters from the Akhmat Special Forces Unit, also located in the area, and that they too have participated in the battle. Certainly they were present in the battle earlier over the course of it. Now, the 98th Guards Division is one of the most storied divisions in the Russian army, but it is only one division, and though it is an airborne division, by definition, that means that it is made up mostly of light infantry, and I don't know its exact size, but a reasonable guess is that it is made up of 3 light infantry regiments. At a guess, perhaps 2,000 men per regiment. Let's say 6,000 to 8,000 men in total in the division. Not a huge force to capture a heavily fortified position like Chasov Yar. But anyway, they've now done it, and Andrei Belousov, the Russian defense minister, has congratulated them. Now that means that the Battle of Bakhmut, the wider Battle of Bakhmut, is finally over. The Russians hold the high ground. Brian Beletic has already provided an analysis of this, not I think yet on his invaluable YouTube channel, but presumably we will be getting one there fairly soon. The point is that with control of Chasov Yar, the Russians now have the high ground. They're able to look down on Konstantinovka and Kramatorsk, and the battle for these two big towns, is likely to start before long. And what makes that even more likely is that we've had further news from Pokrovsk, a little to the west, some distance to the west, and the reports say that the Russians have now enlarged significantly the territory that they control inside Pokrovsk itself, and that they have reached the center, the urban center of Pokrovsk, and that they have indeed cut the E50 road that leads to Pokrovsk from the west, from Dnipro, which, if true, means that the Ukrainian garrison in Pokrovsk is in effect cut off from resupply. Now, unusually, we have had a description of this battle in the Daily Telegraph. They've actually provided us with an account of what is actually happening in Pokrovsk. As I said, most unusual for them to do that, but anyway, they have. And they tell us, the Daily Telegraph describe an increasingly difficult situation for the Ukrainians, not in Pokrovsk itself, but in the town of Dobropilia to the northwest of Pokrovsk. It says that the Russians are within 7 miles of Dobropilia, which corroborates what Redovka, the Russian newspaper that I spoke about yesterday, was saying. They said that the Russians are within 10 kilometers of Dobropilia. 10 kilometers is about the same as 7 miles from Dobropilia. So it looks as if the Russians are indeed closing in increasingly on the situation in Dobropilia as well. And, well, as I said, it was an interesting article, coming as it does from the Daily Telegraph, and I will briefly read parts of it. It says that just 7 miles to the south of Dobropilia, Russian forces are closing in on the city. As their summer offensive grinds forward, the city stands as the last major settlement between Russian troops and a full encirclement of Pokrovsk, a key logistical hub. Its capture would help secure the entirety of the Donetsk region, which Vladimir Putin has claimed in his maximalist demands. Maximalist is, of course, what the British media have been repeatedly saying. Russian troops have been making dangerous advances, effectively severing a key road that is the lifeline for Ukraine's defences in Pokrovsk with drone attacks and ambushes. I'm assuming that this is a reference to the E50. Time is clearly running out for the soldiers on the front line, and families are having to uproot their lives as the bombs get closer and closer. So that's the Daily Telegraph. That's its account of the battle that's playing out in Pokrovsk. It's not Redovka's. It doesn't come from any Russian Telegram channel or blog or website or newspaper or whatever. The Daily Telegraph says that the situation is deteriorating fast, that Pokrovsk is practically surrounded, that the key supply road is now practically unusable because of ambushes. That would suggest that the Russians are indeed, in fact, in control of at least parts of the highway. If they are indeed 10 kilometers from from Dobropilia, 7 miles from Dobropilia, then it is likely that they have indeed crossed the road leading to Pokrovsk from the north, the one that passes through the important villages located there, villages like the important villages like Rodinska and Bilitska. And I've heard reports, incidentally, that the Russians have in fact started to attack Bilitska, and that this village is in the process of being stormed and is likely to fall as well. So anyway, there it is. That is the situation. A rapidly critical situation. Chasov Yar, according to the Russians, now controlled by them. The Daily Telegraph, in effect, corroborating what Radovka is saying. The Russians 7 miles from Dobropilia, 10 kilometers from Dobropilia. The E50 road probably cut off. The Ukrainian garrison in Pokrovsk cut off from supply. I suspect that at some point over the next couple of days, we're going to see a general flight of the Ukrainian forces from Pokrovsk. They will try to escape along the fields to the northeast from places like Grishine and wherever, and Pokrovsk will fall. At which point, of course, it's going to have a big impact on Europe. It's going to have a massive impact in the United States. It'd be very interesting to see how Donald Trump reacts to that news and what, in that case, he is going to choose to do. Now, yesterday, I discussed at great length the various rumours and plots and counterplots that are perhaps playing out in Kiev. And in fact, today, the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada, reconvened, and a law, the text of which I still haven't seen, by the way, was passed, apparently or allegedly reinstating the independence of Nabu and Sopar. And again, it comes with statements, comments from Zelensky, in which he sort of suggests that none of this had anything to do with him, that it was all entirely someone else's fault, and the fact that he signed the law, the original law, ending the independence of these two agencies on the same day as it was passed, presumably that is not his fault. His comments were, this ensures the normal independent, notice the word normal independent operation of anti-corruption bodies and all law enforcement agencies of our state. It's the right decision. It's very important that the state listens to public opinion. Ukraine is a democracy, without doubt. It became clear over the course of the debate, however, that many members of Zelensky's party in the parliament were very unhappy with these different moves that he has made. There was actually a brawl whilst the session was underway. Apparently, MPs, I'm taking this now from the Financial Times, is saying that many of the MPs are saying, presumably to the Financial Times, that their votes cannot be taken for granted by Zelensky in the same way as was the case previously in the future. And, well, we shall see. I just read some of what the Financial Times is saying. Despite the U-turn, Zelensky is likely to suffer lasting damage to his credibility, both within his parliamentary faction and among the broader public. 3 MPs in his ruling Servant of the People party said that they had lost faith in the president and would no longer rubber stamp the bills put forward by him and his office. Another ruling party lawmaker announced he was leaving the faction over last week's vote. Vadim Galaichuk, also a Zelensky party MP, told the Financial Times that the vote seems to be secured today, but future votes are not. And Nabu and Sapor themselves don't appear to believe that their independence has been generally restored. So the Financial Times quotes Alexander Klimenko, the head of Sapor, as saying that the restoration of Nabu and Sapor's independence does not ensure they will operate as efficiently as before. I'm not sure how they operated efficiently before, because to be frank, I never saw them very effective in prosecuting corruption in Ukraine, but never mind. Anyway, Klimenko goes on to say some of them are likely to come. Sapor said that his agency would still face political pressure and smear campaigns. Some of them are likely to come from members of parliament. And he added that Nabu and Sapor are currently investigating corruption against allegations into 31 sitting MPs and 40 lawmakers, including several from Zelensky's own party. And anyway, he doesn't seem to think that this story is ended, and if I have to say it, nor do I. Anyway, we will see. We will see whether there is, at any point over the next few weeks, a genuine resolution to this. I believe that the major purpose of this law, this new law, was to get the European Union to restore funding to Ukraine. One of the MPs actually all but admitted as much. Again, we have it from the Financial Times. Ivana Klimpush-Tsinsadze, an opposition MP and former deputy prime minister, excoriated Zelensky and his party in parliament. You've put at risk the trust of our partners, the state's financing, and Ukraine's path to the EU. So ultimately, it's all about keeping the checks coming. That is what she seems to be saying, or at least that's how I read what she said. But anyway, there it is. The law has been passed. Zelensky's probably going to wait to see what the tariffs and the sanctions that Trump is going to unroll over the next couple of weeks really amounts to. But the reality is Chasov Yar appears to have fallen. I'm sure it has. Pokrovsk is likely to do so fairly soon. Dobropilia looks like it's going to fall as well. The military situation is therefore approaching crisis. It seems to me that when it becomes clear to Zelensky, to Trump, to Ursula von der Leyen, to Friedrich Merz, to Keir Starmer, to Macron, to all of these people, that whatever they're doing now over the course of these weeks is not going to change or alter the dynamics of the conflict in Ukraine. In fact, as I said earlier, Trump has even effectively acknowledged as much. When they understand that, when they finally grasp that they are indeed out of options, that is when the big panic, the really big panic, will begin. And I'm guessing that this will happen in the autumn. As I said in my recent programs, the situation in the Middle East is looking increasingly fragile. The Iranians have repeated over the last 24 hours that they require guarantees before they resume negotiations with the United States. And they're saying that these guarantees, including the United States paying, or at least maybe Israel paying compensation to Iran for the damage done to Iran during the 12-day war, which is a polite way of saying that there will be no negotiations anytime soon between Iran and the Western powers. Well, when all of this begins to hit home in the autumn, as I said, we're going to see a panic and a crisis, the like of which we have never seen before. That is my guess. But as I said, we're living through a turbulent August. Trump, as I said, living from Truth Social Post to Truth Social Post, making decisions, as far as I can tell, on the fly. We will see where they go and what, if anything, they achieve. And as I said, we'll have to get through this stormy August, and then maybe in September we can begin to take proper stock. But in the meantime, I will continue to be here. I will continue to provide my commentary. I'll be back, in fact, tomorrow. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, if you like this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.